At 9:07 a.m., they told me degrees mattered more than systems. At 9:08, I handed in my resignation. By 9:43, the root log was whispering a different truth, and the CTO suddenly realized titles don't grant access, but architects decide who does. The conference room always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ambition. Glass walls, polished table, a skyline pretending to be inspiration. I sat at the far end, laptop closed, hands folded calmly in my lap as if this were a routine check-in and not a quiet execution. HR adjusted her blazer like she was about to deliver a weather report. "He has an MBA. You're just a data architect." Just. The word didn't land loudly. It slid across the table like a thin blade. For a moment, the room was very still. The hum of the air conditioning felt louder than her voice. Outside, someone laughed near the coffee machine. Inside, a hierarchy had just been declared. He, the new head of digital strategy, smiled politely. The kind of smile that had been trained in business school case studies. He didn't look at me when she said it. He didn't have to. I had built the infrastructure he would now strategize. I knew which servers hummed at night and which dashboards were lying. I knew the fragile bridge between finance and operations, held together by scripts I wrote at 2:17 a.m. during a system outage no one remembers anymore. But none of that fits on a framed diploma. "Your role will transition under him," HR continued, sliding a document across the table. "He'll oversee platform decisions moving forward." Oversee. Interesting choice of word. I nodded slowly. Calm, professional, unthreatening. That's how they liked their technical women. Brilliant but quiet, foundational but invisible. My phone buzzed once, a routine system alert, a background job completed successfully. Of course it did, because I designed it that way. He finally spoke. "We're looking to simplify architecture, make it more business-friendly." Business-friendly? I almost smiled. The architecture wasn't complex because I loved complexity. It was complex because their growth had been chaotic, because every rushed acquisition, every impulsive pivot, every urgent feature had been duct-taped into the core. And I had kept it standing. "Of course," I said. "Simplification is important." He relaxed. HR relaxed. They mistook composure for compliance. They always do. At 9:06 a.m., she asked if I had questions. I did, but not the kind she was prepared to answer. Instead, I asked, "When does the transition begin?" "Immediately," she replied, relieved. Immediately. There it was. The air in the room shifted, barely noticeable, like the first tremor before a structural crack. I opened my laptop. He leaned forward, curious now. HR watched carefully. I logged into the admin console. The dashboard bloomed open like a city map at night. Permissions, pipelines, integrations, the quiet, nervous system of the company. "Is that necessary?" HR asked lightly. "Yes," I said, "for a clean transition." Root access. The phrase sat silently behind my eyes. For 3 years, I had been primary administrator, not because I demanded it, but because no one else understood the depth of the system well enough to hold it. Not even the CTO, if we're being honest, especially not an MBA. At 9:08 a.m., I opened a blank email. Subject, resignation. The cursor blinked patiently. I wrote one paragraph, professional, polite, effective immediately. No drama, no accusations, no raised voice, just facts. I hit send. The notification chimed softly, a sound so small for something so irreversible. HR blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" "I'm resigning," I repeated, calm as ever. "Immediately." The new head of digital strategy straightened in his chair, confusion cracking through confidence. "But we just discussed." Yes, I said. You did. Silence expanded between us. It wasn't loud, it was heavy. HR's expression shifted from authority to calculation. You're required to give notice. I'm not, I replied gently. Check my contract. She would, later. For now, her eyes flicked to my screen. I was already inside the admin panel. You see, systems don't care about titles. They care about permissions, and permissions are precise. One by one, I began documenting transfer steps, removing my personal credentials, logging changes, time-stamped, transparent, clean, no sabotage, just structure. The new head of digital strategy cleared his throat. We'll need access to everything. Of course, I said again. And I meant it. But access is not ownership. I reassigned administrator privileges, not to him, to a shared auditable service account under CTO oversight, procedure compliant, security approved, completely legal. HR didn't understand what she was watching. He didn't either, but somewhere in the building, in a quieter office lined with server diagrams and whiteboards full of half-erased architecture maps, the CTO's phone buzzed. Root log updated. Primary admin changed. At 9:11 a.m., my credentials were no longer active. At 9:12, the system rebalanced. At 9:13, I closed my laptop. You'll receive full documentation, I said, standing. Everything is logged. HR opened her mouth, then closed it. He looked unsettled now, not threatened, not yet, just uncertain. Uncertainty is the first crack in confidence. Outside the conference room, the office continued its Monday rhythm. Keyboards clicked, Slack notifications chimed, espresso steamed. No one knew the architecture of power had just shifted. I walked back to my desk slowly. 3 years of late nights, 3 years of invisible heroics, 3 years of being just something. I packed my notebook first, then my mechanical keyboard, the one I bought myself after saving them from a catastrophic database cascade 2 winters ago. A junior engineer approached cautiously. Is it true? Yes. Her eyes widened. But you're the only one who understands the legacy integrations. I paused. That wasn't entirely accurate. The documentation understood. And now, so would the CTO, maybe. My badge felt heavier than usual as I clipped it off. At 9:22 a.m., I walked past the glass conference room again. HR was on the phone. He was typing rapidly, probably searching for enterprise data architecture governance best practices. I didn't look in, because something else was happening upstairs. At 9:43 a.m., in a different office, someone opened the root log, and when they did, the room temperature changed. If you think this was the end of the conversation, you've underestimated how loudly silence can echo through a system. At 9:43 a.m., the root log didn't scream. It whispered, and whispers in infrastructure are far more dangerous. The CTO sat alone in his office, lights off, blinds half drawn against the glare of the late morning sun. He preferred shadows when reading logs, said it helped him see patterns. I used to think that was poetic. Now I wondered if it was instinct. His screen filled with timestamps. 9:08, resignation email sent. 9:09, admin credentials flagged for deactivation. 9:10, privilege reassignment initiated. 9:11, root access transferred. 9:11:32, old tokens revoked. 9:12, system integrity check passed. He leaned back, passed, not broken, not corrupted, not compromised, passed. That was the part that unsettled him, because sabotage is loud, it's chaotic, it gives you someone to blame. This was surgical. He refreshed the log. Who is admin now? He asked the empty room. His voice carried less authority than usual. He navigated to the permissions dashboard. Primary administrator, service account, executive oversight. Secondary, none. For the first time in 3 years, no single human held unilateral system authority. It was clean governance, best practice, exactly what every audit firm recommends. Exactly what he had postponed implementing, because we'll get to it next quarter. Next quarter had arrived without warning. His phone buzzed. HR. He declined the call. Instead, he opened the documentation repository. There it was, a structured index, architecture maps, failover procedures, legacy integration notes, access diagrams, vendor dependencies, escalation trees, and, at the very top, transition summary, effective immediately, no emotion, no commentary, just clarity. He scrolled slowly, jaw tightening. This wasn't impulsive. It had been prepared, carefully. Downstairs, Slack channels were beginning to flicker. Hey, does anyone know who approves pipeline merges now? Why did my elevated access request bounce? Is the new head of digital already reviewing infra changes? The new head of digital strategy, still adjusting to his ergonomic chair, attempted to log into the admin console. Access denied. He tried again. Access denied. He frowned. It wasn't a dramatic denial, no red flashing warnings, just a polite message informing him that permissions must be requested through governance protocol. Protocol? The same word he'd used in the meeting to describe simplifying oversight. He stood up abruptly and headed toward the elevator. Upstairs. The walk was shorter than it felt. Inside the CTO's office, tension had condensed into something almost physical. She locked me out, he said without greeting. The CTO didn't look up immediately. No, he replied quietly. She locked everyone out. A pause, then carefully. That includes you. Silence pressed against the walls. This isn't sustainable, the MBA insisted. We need centralized decision-making. We have it, the CTO said, eyes still on the screen. It's centralized under audit. That distinction mattered, but only if you understood architecture. He opened the infrastructure cost dashboard, cloud expenditure curve, optimized, incident frequency down 37% year over year. Unplanned downtime, minimal. Deployment velocity, stable, all under her tenure. The numbers didn't care about degrees either. HR entered without knocking. She can't just resign like that. She can, the CTO replied. And she did. But this leaves us exposed. No, he said again. It leaves us documented. He rotated the monitor toward them. Look, a detailed rollback protocol for every critical system, automated access approval workflows, escalation trees that now routed through governance instead of personalities. She hadn't burned the house down, she'd fireproofed it, and then walked away. Downstairs, I was stepping into the elevator for the last time. The metallic doors reflected a version of me I barely recognized. Calm. Not victorious. Just steady. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I let it ring. Another notification. Email from CTO. Subject, can we talk? I didn't open it. Not yet. Outside, the city air felt different, sharp, almost electric. Morning traffic roared like nothing significant had happened. But something had. Inside that glass building, power dynamics were rearranging themselves like unstable code. Because here's the part they hadn't considered. When you remove a systems architect, you don't just lose maintenance, you lose intuition, and intuition doesn't transfer in a zip file. Upstairs, the new head of digital strategy was pacing now. We need root access assigned to me immediately. The CTO folded his hands. No. One word, measured. We assign root through board-level approval now. Since when? Since 9/11. That landed. HR's expression shifted again, from frustration to concern. Are we at risk? The CTO looked back at the root log. Clean, stable, audited. No, he said slowly. We're compliant. Compliance. The word tasted different in the room. For years, compliance had been something we promised during investor calls. Now it was embedded, irreversible. He opened my resignation email at last. No accusations, no bitterness. Just gratitude for the opportunity. Professional to the end, which made it harder to dismiss, because anger can be labeled as emotional. Precision cannot. Down on the sidewalk, I finally opened his message. 3 lines. We need to discuss next steps. Call me. CTO, next steps. Interesting phrase. For 3 years, I had been reacting to their urgency. Now they were reacting to my absence. My phone buzzed again. Another message, then another. Slack notifications stacking like dominoes. I silenced them all. There's a specific quiet that comes when you step away from something that consumed you. It's not relief at first. It's space. And space can feel terrifying. But it also allows perspective. Behind me, 32 floors above, a board notification had just been triggered automatically. Administrative governance structure updated. That alert didn't go to HR. It didn't go to the MBA. It went to people who read risk reports, and risk reports read logs. If you think they'll simply move on and replace me quietly, you're underestimating how expensive clarity can become once it's documented. If you've ever been underestimated in a room full of titles, stay with this story. Comment root if you believe skill outlasts status. By noon, the building no longer felt like a monument to innovation. It felt like a question mark. The executive floor had grown unusually quiet. Not the productive quiet of focused work, but the restrained silence of people recalculating narratives. The kind that follows a board notification no one was prepared to explain. The subject line was sterile. Administrative governance structure updated. But beneath it lay something sharper. Risk exposure analysis triggered by privilege reassignment. The board didn't panic. They asked for context. And context, unlike confidence, requires substance. The CTO stood at the head of the long walnut table during the emergency call. The MBA sat 2 seats down, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. HR was present, but quiet now, far quieter than she had been at 9:07 a.m. On the shared screen, the root log glowed with time-stamped precision. Why was administrative control consolidated under a service account? One board member asked. The question wasn't hostile, it was surgical. The CTO inhaled slowly. It wasn't consolidated, he replied. It was decentralized into audit. A subtle but critical distinction. Another pause. And why, the same board member continued, was that not already the case? There it was, not anger, exposure. Because governance best practices aren't new, they're just inconvenient when speed is worshipped over structure. The MBA cleared his throat. We were in the process of strategic simplification, the board member interrupted gently. Strategic simplification does not supersede security protocol. The room temperature shifted. The root log remained calm. Clean transitions, no anomalies, no sabotage, full documentation. It was difficult to criticize a process that followed every compliance guideline they had previously cited in investor briefings. Outside that room, Slack had evolved from confusion to unease. Are we under audit? Why did illegal request infrastructure diagrams? Did something happen? Something had. But it wasn't a breach, it was visibility. The CTO opened the documentation repository again, this time projecting it. Transition summary, effective immediately. He scrolled past architectural diagrams and paused at a section titled Single Point of Failure Risk, Human Dependency. The room went very still, because that heading didn't accuse, it revealed. For 3 years, administrative control had been concentrated in one individual, not by ego, but by necessity. Every delay in formal governance had been signed off by leadership prioritizing agility. And now, that agility had a timestamp. One board member leaned forward. So she implemented governance during resignation? Yes, the CTO admitted. And without operational disruption? Yes. That answer carried weight. The MBA shifted slightly. But we lost critical knowledge. Did we? The board member asked. The CTO clicked open another folder. Escalation trees, failover scripts, vendor negotiation histories, incident post-mortems, meticulous. The board member nodded slowly. Then what exactly was lost? The question lingered longer than anyone expected, because the honest answer was uncomfortable. Control had shifted, not to chaos, to accountability. Meanwhile, my phone lay face down on the kitchen counter. Sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, illuminating dust particles that moved lazily in the air, unhurried, unbothered. I made coffee without glancing at notifications. The rhythm felt unfamiliar. For years, mornings began with dashboards. Now, there was quiet. My laptop remained closed, but across the city, mine had just been opened again. In the legal department, not to investigate me, to review internal policy gaps. At 1:17 p.m., the board issued a formal request, provide timeline of delayed governance implementation over the past 36 months. The number hung heavily. 36 months, the exact duration of my tenure as primary administrator. Correlation is not accusation, but it invites questions. The MBA's earlier confidence had thinned into calculation. He approached the CTO after the call. This doesn't have to become political. It isn't, the CTO replied. It's structural. And optics. Optics follow logs. Another silence, the kind that feels like an architectural beam cracking somewhere behind drywall. In the afternoon, HR drafted a statement. Leadership transition underway. Infrastructure governance modernization completed successfully. Careful language, very careful. Because to frame it as disruption would imply instability, and instability affects valuation. But to frame it as success would imply foresight, which they didn't have. At 2:03 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the CTO, it was legal. Subject, clarification on governance protocol implementation. I read the preview line. We would appreciate a brief conversation regarding the recent structural updates. Appreciate, not require. Interesting. I placed the phone down again, not out of avoidance, out of timing. There's power in responding. There's more power in choosing when. Back in the executive office, the CTO reopened the root log once more. He zoomed in on 9/11/32, old tokens revoked. That was the moment control truly changed, not when I resigned, not when the MBA was hired, not when HR said just, but when human dependency became system accountability. He leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing patterns in the timestamps. For the first time all day, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not because he had won anything, but because the system had stabilized beyond personality. And stability is expensive to ignore. By late afternoon, the board had scheduled a governance review session. Mandatory attendance, including the new head of digital strategy. Titles would be discussed, so would risk. If you think this is about a resignation, you're missing the architecture underneath it. By the next morning, The company's glass facade reflected something sharper than sunlight: accountability. The governance review session began at 8:30 a.m. sharp, not 8:32, not 8:35, sharp. When boards adjust their tone, they adjust their clocks first. The walnut table felt longer than usual. The CTO arrived early. Legal sat beside him, laptops open, expressions neutral but alert. HR carried a folder she wouldn't open unless absolutely necessary. The new head of digital strategy entered last, posture composed, confidence carefully reconstructed overnight. On the central screen, one document glowed: Infrastructure Governance Timeline, 36 months. The first slide was simple. Administrative authority assigned to Senior Data Architect, temporary, pending governance framework. Temporary. The word lingered like an unpaid invoice. Slide 2. Governance framework drafted, deferred Q2, deferred Q3, deferred Q4, reprioritized to growth acceleration. Deferred again. Each bullet point had initials next to it, approval chains, executive signatures. Speed had been celebrated in town halls, agility praised in quarterly meetings. Documentation, however, remembers what applause forgets. One board member folded their hands. Why was this repeatedly postponed? The MBA spoke first this time. We were scaling aggressively. Centralized oversight can slow innovation. A calm pause followed. Centralized oversight, the board member replied evenly, is not the same as individual dependency. The distinction landed cleanly, because innovation without governance is momentum without brakes. The CTO shifted in his chair. We prioritized delivery, he said carefully. She maintained system integrity during that period. Maintained, the board member echoed. At personal liability? That question changed the air. Legal finally spoke. There was no formal indemnification clause for unilateral root-level decisions. Silence, because root access without indemnification isn't authority. It's exposure. For 3 years, I had carried operational risk on paper that leadership had deferred in practice. Not loudly, not angrily, just consistently. The board advanced to the final slide: 908, resignation; 911, governance activation; 0 downtime; 0 data loss; 0 compliance violations. The numbers were blunt. This was not an act of disruption, one board member concluded. It was a correction. Correction. The MBA inhaled sharply. Are we implying misconduct? No, came the calm response. We are acknowledging misalignment. Upstairs in my apartment, I was reviewing my own documentation, not out of anxiety, but closure, contracts, performance reviews. Promotion recommendations that had been budget constrained, salary adjustments that lagged behind market benchmarks. There's a peculiar clarity that arrives when you step outside a system and look back at it structurally instead of emotionally. Patterns emerge. Patterns don't argue. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a senior engineer. Just wanted to say, thank you. We didn't realize how much you were shielding. Shielding, that word stayed with me. Because architecture isn't just code, it's protection. Back in the boardroom, a decision was forming. Not dramatic, not explosive, but procedural. Immediate governance policy update. Formalized administrative oversight. Retroactive risk audit. Executive accountability review. The MBA's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, calculation again. Because in corporate ecosystems, consequences rarely arrive as shouting matches. They arrive as committees. HR finally opened her folder. We should also address internal communication, she offered carefully. There's growing speculation. Speculation thrives in silence. Transparency dissolves it. The board nodded. A company-wide statement, one member said. Not defensive, factual. The CTO understood the subtext. Control narratives before they control valuation. At 11:12 a.m., draft circulated. Following a successful governance modernization, administrative authority has transitioned to an audited executive framework. We thank our former data architect for implementing a secure and compliant structure. Thank. The word wasn't decorative, it was strategic, because diminishing the architect now would undermine the legitimacy of the structure she implemented. Irony has impeccable timing. The MBA stared at the screen. She resigned voluntarily, he said quietly. Yes, the CTO replied. And we're validating her actions. Yes? Another silence, this one heavier. Because validation alters hierarchy more than resignation ever could. By early afternoon, legal sent me a formal note. Subject: appreciation and clarification. The message was measured. We acknowledge your implementation of governance protocols in alignment with compliance standards. We would welcome an exit discussion to ensure continuity. Welcome, not demand. I read it twice. For the first time since 9:07 a.m. the day before, I allowed myself a slow exhale that felt like relief rather than restraint. They weren't chasing me. They were adjusting around the absence, and that difference matters. Meanwhile, the CTO opened the root log once more, not out of concern, but reflection. The entries were static now, stable, balanced, no single name attached to ultimate control. Architecture had outlived ego. He leaned back and murmured to himself, almost amused. Degrees don't design systems. Across town, I finally replied to legal, short, professional, available for conversation next week. Next week. Time, once dictated by outages and executive urgency, now belonged to me. If you think the story ends with a governance review, you're overlooking what happens when reputation recalibrates quietly behind closed doors. The exit conversation was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m., not in the glass conference room, not in HR, but in the CTO's office. That detail mattered. I arrived 5 minutes early, not out of obligation, out of habit. The building felt the same, yet subtly rearranged. People looked up when I passed, not dramatically, just long enough to register context. Respect always walks slower than dismissal. The CTO stood when I entered. He hadn't done that during our last infrastructure planning meeting. Thank you for coming, he said, professional, controlled. But there was something new in his tone. Wait. Legal joined remotely. HR was absent this time. Also meaningful. We didn't begin with pleasantries. We reviewed the governance timeline, he said. We should have implemented that framework earlier. A direct acknowledgement. No hedging. I recommended it repeatedly, I replied calmly. I know. Silence settled, not tense, just honest. On his screen, the root log was open again. The same timestamp, 9/11/32, old tokens revoked. I underestimated the exposure, he admitted, and I underestimated you. There it was, not emotional, structural. Underestimation isn't loud, it's quiet and procedural. A promotion delayed, a title withheld, authority assumed to be temporary. I didn't smile. I built redundancy into the system, I said, not into the hierarchy. That line lingered between us. Legal cleared their throat through the speaker. We'd like to discuss a transition consultancy agreement. Interesting, the CTO continued. Board recommendation, limited term, governance advisory capacity. Advisory, not subordinate, not just. I folded my hands. And reporting structure. Direct to executive oversight, he replied. with indemnification. Indemnification. The word felt like balance finally entering the equation. For 3 years, I had carried structural risk without formal protection. Now, protection was being offered, not as a favor, but as correction. I considered the offer without rushing. Power isn't in saying yes immediately. It's in knowing you can say no. Defined scope, I said. Clear boundaries, no operational firefighting. A pause. Agreed. And compensation aligned with advisory market standards. Another pause. Agreed. No negotiation theatrics, no ego posturing, just recalibration. Outside that office, the new head of digital strategy was presenting a revised transformation roadmap to middle management. The slides were polished, the language confident, but one slide had changed: infrastructure governance, executive oversight model. A footnote at the bottom referenced foundational framework established Q1. No names, yet everyone in the room knew. Reputation doesn't need spotlight when the structure speaks. The CTO closed the root log. We also issued an internal acknowledgement, he added, public-facing version pending. Keep it factual, I said. He nodded. Emotional narratives fade. Documentation endures. When I left the building again, it wasn't as an employee. It wasn't as someone dismissed. It was as an external architect whose design now governed from above the org chart. 2 days later, the company released a formal statement to stakeholders. The organization has completed a comprehensive governance modernization, reinforcing secure administrative oversight and audit transparency. We extend our appreciation to the architect who initiated this transition. Carefully phrased, legally clean, strategically humble. Industry forums picked it up quietly, not as scandal, not as crisis, as maturity. Meanwhile, recruiters began reaching out. Subject lines shifted from exciting opportunity for senior engineer to board-level advisory role inquiry. Perception had recalibrated, not because I demanded recognition, because the root log recorded integrity. Weeks later, during the first governance advisory session, I observed the executive table from a different seat, not at the end, not overshadowed, but positioned where structural decisions originate. The MBA presented confidently. He had adapted. To his credit, he listened more now. The CTO referenced compliance proactively. HR spoke less about hierarchy, more about clarity. Architecture had reshaped culture without confrontation. After the meeting, a junior engineer approached me in the hallway. I heard what happened, she said quietly. You didn't fight, you just structured. I smiled then. Systems respond to structure, I replied. People eventually do too. That evening, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop, not to monitor alerts, not to fix emergencies, but to draft a white paper on governance design in high-growth environments. Title: Designing Power Without Single Points of Failure. There was a strange peace in writing it. Because the real victory hadn't been resignation, it hadn't been validation. It was this: no one would ever again carry that level of structural risk in silence inside that company. The root log still updates every day. New entries, new decisions. But none of them hinge on one name anymore. And somewhere in the metadata of that system, invisible but permanent, there's a timestamp that changed more than permissions. 9/11/32. Not revenge, not rebellion, just architecture correcting gravity.